that, in the waning days of 1776, George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, was having a very bad week. His army was demoralized after suffering a series of defeats at the hands of the British. The Americans had just lost the Battle of Brandywine, the Battle of Germantown, and the Siege of Fort Washington, all within a 2-month span. As a result, his troops were low on supplies and even lower on morale. Even worse, Congress had just rejected a proposal to allow African Americans into the Continental Army as soldiers. This was despite the fact that thousands of enslaved African Americans were fighting for the Patriot cause, many without pay. And perhaps most galling of all, Washington's forces were in full retreat from the city of Philadelphia, which the British had captured in September. The army was now making for the Delaware River, hoping to establish a new encampment at Allentown, Pennsylvania. But the weather, as it often does in Pennsylvania, had other plans. The river had frozen over, and Washington was forced to make a choice: spend a miserable night along the riverbank or attempt to cross over and find shelter in New Jersey. He chose to try and cross the river, but it was a risky move. The wind chill made it feel like 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The men were exhausted and they had almost no supplies. By the time they reached the river, Washington's force of nearly 2,400 men began wading into the icy water. Within seconds, the men's shoes were soaked and their feet were numb. Some men fell through the ice-jammed water and had to be rescued by their comrades. One eyewitness described the crossing as, quote, "one continued scene of misery." Soon enough, the men began to suffer from hypothermia, causing confusion, disorientation, and uncontrollable shivering. It was clear to Washington that he had made a terrible mistake. The crossing was going to take too long, and his men wouldn't make it to Allentown in time before nightfall. So he ordered the troops to halt their progress and set up camp along the riverbank. As the sun set, temperatures plummeted. Howling winds whipped across the exposed riverbank, and snow piled up quickly in the freezing cold. Washington spent the night with his troops, sharing their misery. In the morning, 2 things happened. First, it stopped snowing. Second, George Washington was very cold. He needed to get out of the river and fast. There was only one problem: he couldn't feel his feet. Hypothermia had kicked in and his feet were so swollen that he could not pull on his boots. Now, any one of these problems would have been enough to send an army back to its barracks, but Washington had 2 problems, and he solved them both by doing something crazy. He took off his boots and he walked barefoot in the snow towards a nearby farmhouse. He sent a staff officer back to retrieve his horse, which he rode back to camp to dry his clothes and warm himself up. After a breakfast of burnt coffee and cold bread, he gathered his troops and announced that they would cross the river again. His officers tried to dissuade him, pointing out that the men were too cold and exhausted to march. But Washington had already made up his mind. At 4 o'clock that morning, the troops began to march north toward the village of Trenton. They were tired, they were cold, and they were barefoot. After marching 5 miles, the troops arrived at Trenton. What happened next would go down in history as one of the most audacious and important military victories of the entire American Revolution. George Washington didn't become famous for his brilliant offensive maneuvers or for masterminding elaborate strategies. He became famous because he never gave up. He kept showing up even when his army was defeated, demoralized, and freezing their butts off. He led his ragtag band of farmers, blacksmiths, and schoolteachers against one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and he never backed down. And it wasn't just his perseverance that made him such an effective leader. It was also his ability to inspire the people around him. The men in his army weren't particularly well trained or well equipped, but they followed him anyway. They followed him across the Delaware River in the middle of winter, and they followed him into battle against the mighty British Empire. And they did all of this because they believed in what he was trying to accomplish. When Washington took command of the Continental Army, the task was almost impossible. The army was green, the supplies were low, and the odds were stacked against them. But Washington never lost faith in his troops. He knew that they could win if they worked together and never gave up. And it was that belief that inspired the men to follow him into battle, no matter how bleak the situation looked. To understand how Washington got where he is, we need to go back to the beginning. He was born in 1732 near Alexandria, Virginia, into a wealthy landowner family. From an early age, he showed the traits that would make him one of the most successful generals in American history. He was brave, determined, and always willing to take on a challenge. As a young man, he studied surveying and began working as a surveyor in Virginia. It was during this time that he developed his love of the outdoors and his ability to read the land around him. This skill would later help him to win battles by allowing him to outmaneuver his opponents. In 1759, Washington was appointed to the rank of major in the Virginia militia, and in 1763 he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. During this time, he continued to hone his military skills and make a name for himself as a leader. But it was during the French and Indian War that Washington really came into his own. He led a force of 150 Virginians in an attack on a French detachment near Fort Necessity, although the attack was ultimately unsuccessful. Washington's bravery and determination impressed everyone who witnessed it. But even as he was gaining military experience and recognition, Washington was also coming to understand the dangers of unchecked power. He saw firsthand the abuses of authority by the British military and the negative effects it had on the colonists. This experience would shape his views on leadership and inspire him to fight for liberty and independence. When the American Revolution began, it was clear that Washington would play a key role. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and tasked with the nearly impossible mission of defeating the British Empire. But Washington was up to the task. He led the army through a series of victories and defeats, always keeping his eye on the ultimate goal of independence. Despite the odds being stacked against them, Washington and his troops persevered. They endured harsh winters, supply shortages, and constant attacks from the British, but they never gave up, and ultimately, their perseverance paid off. With Washington's leadership, the Americans won the war and secured their independence. But Washington's contributions to the American Revolution went beyond just military victories. He was also a symbol of the ideals of the revolution itself. He represented the idea that ordinary people could come together and fight for their freedom against all odds. He embodied the values of courage, determination, and selflessness that were at the heart of the revolutionary cause. Today, we remember George Washington not just as a military leader, but as a symbol of the American ideal. He showed us that it doesn't matter where you come from or what obstacles you face. If you believe in something, you should never give up. Thanks for watching.